Hey, Village, just wanted to take a few minutes as we've been sending out these devotionals. Um, one thing I've been thinking about is really our emotional response during this time. If you're like me, it probably fluctuates a little bit. Certainly, now that it's been a couple of weeks, starting to kind of settle in, and I think the reality of this isn't going to be something that passes within a week or two, that this is going to be months, and probably something that we'll be dealing with maybe for years in some ways, and until this normalizes with vaccines and things like that, and just wondering how this might even change our world and our society. And so I just want to take a moment to encourage us, as John in our first couple devotionals has been encouraging us to abide with Jesus. And part of abiding with Jesus is being honest about how we feel about certain things. And as I've talked to different folks, there's a spectrum, isn't there? On the one hand, we can fall into despair when you think about the impact of this that it currently is having, with thousands of people dying, and the way in which they're dying alone, without their families, mostly elderly folks. And if we listen to worst case scenarios and think about how that could descend into anarchy, how governments could be upturned, we think about the most vulnerable people in refugee camps, and all the things that we're normally worried about. And then you put this on top of it, a global pandemic on top of that. And we can really fall into a despair of, of depression, and to really be, I guess, just despairing of what might come of all of these vulnerable people, never mind our own selves. And maybe we the uncertainty of wondering how this will impact our finances, with job losses, incomes being delayed, all those sorts of things. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I think there's people who want to try to see the best in everything. Think this will probably, this might blow over in a month or two, and then we can kind of go back to normal. This won't be that impactful, and embracing this as a time to spend with my family, if you live with a family, or get some projects done, or almost seeing it as a gift of a forced sabbatical in some kind of way. And so you have these kind of extreme, kind of polar opposites in that. And so my question, I guess, that I've been thinking a lot about was Jesus's ministry, and how he would have seen and known way more about suffering than we do, even his own impending suffering as he goes to the cross, and knowing what was ahead of him in those kind of ways. How did Jesus do that? How did he minister to people? How did he see the sick? How did he minister to the poor? How did he do all those things while still maintaining some sense of joy? Jesus doesn't seem like a depressive hermit. He doesn't seem like a cantankerous person. Children are wanting to come and spend time with him. Drunks, people who eat too much, who party, prostitutes are attracted to Jesus. That doesn't strike me as somebody who is a very stoic kind of personality at all. And Jesus is able to fight for. Maybe Jesus didn't have to fight for joy. We have to fight for joy in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of all of these things. And so I want to just draw our attention to John chapter 5, because I think there's a lot of things that we can, some principles in here that we can learn from. So John chapter 5, verse 2 says this. It says, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these laid a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man who had been there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, he knew that he had already been there a long time. He said to him, 'Do you want to be healed?' And the sick man answered him, 'Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me.' And Jesus said to him, 'Get up, take up your bed, and walk.' And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, 'It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed.' But he answered them, 'The man who healed me, that man said to me, Take up your bed and walk.' Then they asked him, 'Who is the man who said to you, Take up your bed and walk?' Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. So here you have Jesus coming into a place where all of the invalids would have been under these colonnades, a multitude of them, a crowd of them. Jesus steps into that place, heals one person, and leaves. Now, this is Jesus. He literally could have cleared out the place. He could have healed all of them. Jesus literally would have been stepping over other invalids to get to this one man to heal him. And the man, verse 14, afterward Jesus found the man in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." And the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But this is the key here in verse 17. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." And I think that's what we have to be reminded of. We can look around to all of what is going on in the world, the suffering, the uncertainty, the poor, the refugees, all the vulnerable that we have. And we can really, if we lose sight of the fact that Jesus is working, that God the Father is working, that he is accomplishing his purposes and his plans, and he will use even global pandemics to do those things, we can really fall into despair. Jesus reminded his disciples as well that we would always have the poor with us. And that doesn't mean that we don't work to take care of the poor. That's part of what Jesus came to do. His ministry certainly was centered around a lot of caring for the poor, pushing back against injustice. But he also reminded them, as they do that, that the only thing that is going to ultimately solve these problems is Jesus coming and ruling and reigning on the earth once again. And so we work for justice. We push back against the darkness. We provide for those who are in need, and we want to continue to do this during this time. But we can't go into despair. Jesus says none of those things are ultimately going to be fixed until I return. You'll always have the poor with you. There will always be death. There will always be disease. It's only the gospel of Jesus Christ that actually ultimately solves all of those things. There will be a day one day where there will be no more death. There will be no more sorrow. There will be no more disease, no more coronaviruses or any of these things. No more poor, no more inequality, no more injustice. But until then, our Father is working, and Jesus is working, and he's even working in the midst of this. And so my encouragement for us today is to remember these things when we feel like we are despairing, especially in things that we have no control over personally, that we trust that our Father is working. We trust that Jesus is working. He's working out his plans for our good and for his glory. And so we have to fight for joy in the midst of these things. It's also a time for us to realize that we are not in control, that we can't control these things, that we have to rest, that we have to sleep, and that we have a God who doesn't need to sleep, that he doesn't need to slumber, that he's not asleep at the wheel, that we can trust that he is going about his work, and that we join him in that for the renewal of all things. And so we do our part. We don't fall into despair. We're still able to contend for joy in the midst of even hard times, in the midst of sorrow. And we build our joy on the truth of what God is. I think it was Augustine that said that happiness is joy in knowing the truth. And the truth is that God is still at work. And so we can base our joy on that. And at times, even in the sorrow, we can find happiness. We can look for the things that God is doing, even positively. We can receive this time as a gift for rest, for a time of Sabbath, a time of reflection, the time to press in, to pray what God might be doing in our lives, both as individuals, what he's doing collectively in our local church, what he is saying to the church globally, in ways that he might be shaping and changing things. When you think about that, how might God get the attention of the whole world at the same time? A global pandemic certainly is doing that. And so let's trust our Heavenly Father. Let's rest in his sovereignty. Let's rejoice that he is good, and that he is still at work. He's working in your life. He's working in my life, and he's working out his plans globally across the earth. And in that way, then, like this man, We see that we are well. Um, we rejoice in what Jesus has done for us. That even though we have sickness and dust now, is ultimately healed us. And so, even as we push toward Palm Sunday, the good news of the resurrection is looming large over us over the next couple weeks as we celebrate Easter. Easter isn't canceled. Jesus is still raised from the dead, and the good news is still going forward. So rest in that, church, this morning. Do not despair, knowing that your Father is still at work.